Center for Strategic International Study, Washington, D.C., USA. Then we have Ms. Marites Vitug from Rappler, the Philippines, the author of the very famous book we know. Then Mr. Sumathy Permal, Fellow and Head of Center for Straits of Malacca, Maritime Militia of Malaysia. And last but not least, Professor Zhiyong, Director, the Institute for International Relations, Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences, China. And we have the discussant, Dr. Bill Hayton, Associate Fellow, Asia Pacific Program, Chatham House, UK. It has become the tradition of the conference series that we have the very first section to give the overviews of what happens in the between of the two conferences. So from the 10th and now the 11th conference, we have so many new developments with implications, and we also see the continuity in the developments of the South China Sea and the South China Sea related issues. As the book list has suggested, this panel would look into the questions of identifying threats, risks, and opportunities. And the theme that came from the presentations in the opening sections is that we do have some challenging issues, but at the same time, we also have cooperation between and among the stakeholders in the South China Sea. So I think that our panel will focus on that, and we have the variety of the panelists coming from various parts of the world, very different and important think tanks in Asia, in the US, and in Europe. So without further ado, I would like to introduce the panelists to take the floor first in the order that I have just introduced. So each of the panelists would have about 10 minutes to spend on his or her presentation. And the screens before us is suggesting the time we do have for our presentation. So Greg, you have the floor.
Thank you, Tung. Thank you to DAV. It's great to be back. It's been a couple years since I've been able to attend. This working? Okay. So I've got either the easiest or the hardest job, I guess, depending on how you look at it. Starting off first means you have nothing to compare my presentation to, but it also means that everybody's awake and actually prepared to listen, so I can't be too terrible. As Tung said, my job is simply to provide an update. Where do facts stand on the water over the last year? And what's been quite clear is that we have moved into a new phase of the South China Sea disputes over really the last 2 years. By the middle of 2016, China had effectively completed the construction of its island bases in the South China Sea. We haven't seen any new landfill since the spring of 2017. By the end of 2017, China effectively completed the building of infrastructure at all of those island bases. Radar installations, hangars for aircraft, missile shelters, buried facilities to house weapons and ammunition and fuel. And we've seen really no new construction for almost 2 years now. Early 2018 saw the deployment of the first really high-end weapons platforms, jamming equipment, the first landings of military aircraft at Subi Reef and Mischief Reef, the deployments of anti-ship and anti-air missiles for the first time. But the real change in the status quo has been in the ability of civilian forces, the Coast Guard and the Maritime Militia in particular, to operate throughout the entire South China Sea in a way that was impossible just a few years ago. From certainly the start of last year and kicking into high gear this year, we have seen a persistent presence of both China Coast Guard and China militia vessels through every inch of the 9-dash line in a way that is clearly impeding the ability of Vietnamese, Filipino, and Malaysian actors to go about their normal business. So things that were objected to on paper by Beijing for decades, but really just went about normally, are now being harassed and intimidated frequently. That's been in the papers, of course, here in Vietnam regarding the issues around Vanguard Bank, but it is not just restricted to oil and gas operations off the coast of Vietnam. So let me talk about the two different parts here. First, the Coast Guard, and then I'll move on to the Maritime Militia. What is most clear on the Coast Guard front is that Beijing has made a decision that it will no longer tolerate new oil and gas work anywhere in the South China Sea. And that includes new drilling within existing oil and gas blocks. So not just Rosneft's drilling in Block 6-1, we have seen the same type of harassment of Sarawak shell work off the coast of Malaysia. And this is paired with an increase in the frequency of Chinese Coast Guard patrols around a handful of very important, symbolically important features in China's mind, over which China does not actually have, well, with the exception of Scarborough Shoal, over which China doesn't really have effective control, but Beijing is determined to project power. So this is a look at just the different Chinese Coast Guard vessels that patrolled 3 of these important reefs: Laconia off the coast of Malaysia, Scarborough Shoal, and Second Thomas Shoal, where the Philippines has about 10 Marines occupying the grounded ship, the Sierra Madre. China has been patrolling all of these since at least 2013, but they were relatively infrequent. Chinese patrols would come out for a couple weeks, then they would go back to Hainan or to Woody Island, and they would come back a month later. Today, they stay for months at a time. At Laconia Shoals, between September 2018 and September 2019, there was a China Coast Guard ship on station 258 out of 365 days. At Second Thomas Shoal, there was a Chinese Coast Guard ship on station 215 out of 365 days. And it's telling that we know that because these Chinese vessels are broadcasting AIS signals all the time. They want to be seen. China Coast Guard ships everywhere else in the South China Sea run dark most of the time. When they are patrolling these underwater reefs off the coast of Malaysia and the Philippines, they make sure that they're broadcasting so Malaysian and Filipino officials know they're there and know that there's nothing they can do about it. Now, why is there nothing they can do about it? Well, when you look at these vessels, the most frequently deployed are the Shu Chao Tu and the Jiao Lai class. Those are basically unarmed, small arms only, but they're about twice as big as the Royal Malaysian Navy ships, much less the Filipino Navy ships that are sent out to monitor them. In cases like the situation off Vanguard Bank that we've seen, and also deployments around a handful of Philippine islands, China deploys the Jiaoduan and Jiaojun class there. Those are equipped with 76mm cannons. They are better armed than any of the Navy vessels of at least the Philippines and Malaysia that are sent out to confront them. Let me see if I get this right. There we go. This is what a pretty average patrol now looks like around the Sierra Madre, the Filipino ship that's grounded on Second Thomas Shoal. It used to be, as I said, once in a while, a China Coast Guard ship would come out for a week or two. Now, 1 and often 2 ships are there 24/7. And you can see Mischief Reef, the major Chinese base just off the north side of the northwest side of the map there, is used to maintain these patrols. Anytime they need to, they can run just 20 miles away to rest and replenish at Mischief Reef. There is no longer a need to travel 800 miles back to the coast of Hainan. This has become most apparent in the case of Vietnam over the last 4 months with Block 6-1 and the harassment of the Rosneft rig. But it's important to, again, recognize that this does not just target Vietnam. Prior to the start of the standoff over Block 6-1, we saw the exact same behavior displayed by China Coast Guard vessels off the coast of Malaysia in Block SK-308 there. That's operated by Sarawak Shell, an affiliate of Royal Dutch Shell. The China Coast Guard vessel, 35111, spent about 2 weeks patrolling Laconia Shoals, and while patrolling, got dangerously close to the Sapora Esperanza, a drilling rig that had been contracted to work there, and more importantly, repeatedly got in the way and harassed the operations of civilian supply ships that were coming to and from the rig from Malaysia's Sarawak state. This is what one day of AIS traffic we monitored looked like, and this happened every day for 2 weeks. You have small civilian vessels just trying to do their job when a China Coast Guard ship comes in at high speed and cuts across their bow in clear violations of coal regs, and in a clear effort to send a message that any operations, continued operations by these ships, comes with a severe risk of collision, a collision that obviously will not hurt the China Coast Guard ship. After it got done that harassment, that exact same China Coast Guard ship, the 35111, briefly returned to Hainan before it headed out to Vanguard Bank and engaged in the exact same type of operation toward the Hakoryu 5, the rig that Rosneft had contracted. And again, the major target was not really the rig, it was the civilian supply vessels coming to and from Vung Tau. This went on not for 2 weeks, but for 4 months, until about a week and a half ago, when the Rosneft rig finally left. And while Vietnam refused to give up, China decided to escalate horizontally by sending its own state-owned survey ships into the Vietnamese EEZ to conduct hydrographic surveys. This is what the Haiyang Dija 8 was doing for just the first 2 weeks of this 4-month standoff. And you can see on any given day how the standoff resulted in a clear risk of collision between the China Coast Guard ships that were escorting the vessel and the Vietnamese Coast Guard ships that tried to get in their way. This is the new normal. The message is that any new Southeast Asian energy exploration is going to come with an unacceptably high risk of collision. China is not going to use military force. It's just going to make it all but impossible for any commercial entity to rationalize why they should invest in offshore energy work. And my prediction is that pretty soon it's going to be you're going to have two choices if you're a Southeast Asian country. You can either leave the gas in the ground or you can cooperate with CNOOC, because no foreign company, not even any state-owned company, is going to be able to rationalize why this is a good investment. Now, the second fleet that I'll talk about are the Maritime Militia, because they're actually far more numerous than the Coast Guard, and they're really the tip of the spear. I apologize. I'm not sure how much closer I can get this. Wow. That's quite an echo. Look, so the Maritime Militia. When I use that term, I'm not using a term of art. This is mandated by Chinese law. The 1982 military service law in China requires all men who leave service to serve in the militia, both on land and at sea. In 2013, Xi Jinping traveled to the Tanmen militia unit in Tanmen on Hainan and thanked them for their patriotic service. These units are regularly featured in broadcasts on Chinese state media. They brag about their activities on social media. It is only in the foreign press that Chinese diplomats like to pretend that either there is no militia or that we overestimate their numbers. What has really changed over the last few years is that they no longer operate just out of Hainan and out of Woody Island on the Paracels. They are now home ported in the Spratlys, just like the Coast Guard. So for 6 months last year, we looked in various remote sensing spectra to try to get a handle on just how many of those there are. When you look at the Spratly Islands in SAR, the space-based radar, you see hundreds of metal vessels that are clearly too large to be Vietnamese blue boats or Filipino bangas that aren't broadcasting AIS. You see the same thing when you look in infrared, a whole lot of lights at sea, none of which seem to be correlated with AIS signatures. And when we use that to task collections of high-resolution satellite imagery, this shot here is of all of the outposts being occupied by China and Vietnam, unsurprisingly we found that the largest fleet of vessels operating in the Spratlys are Chinese fishing vessels averaging over 50 meters and 500 tons that never seem to fish. They spend weeks, often months at a time, riding at anchor in large groupings like this. This is a picture of Subi Reef. The only time they leave those reefs is when they're dropping anchor around outposts occupied by Vietnam and the Philippines. And their numbers have been increasing steadily ever since the completion of the infrastructure at Subi and Mischief Reef. The numbers are completely unrelated to the fishing season. They've just been increasing steadily as these boats no longer have to go back to Hainan to replenish, at least not as frequently. And their use was made quite obvious early this year when, in response to the Philippines starting long-delayed upgrade work to Thitu Island here, China deployed about 100 of these ships. There's 95 in that photo. They dropped anchor as close as 2 nautical miles from Thitu. None of them ever put nets in the water. None of them ever displayed any fishing activity. And they have maintained that presence for almost a year. The numbers have gone up and they've gone down, sometimes as low as a dozen, sometimes well over 100. They are still there today, getting in the way, monitoring the Philippine activity, and trying to intimidate the Philippines to back off from this construction work. We've also seen deployments at other features occupied by the Philippines as well as by Vietnam. This is a shot of Loita Cay, or what the Philippines calls Panata Island, the most remote occupied outpost in the Spratlys. It's essentially a trailer with no way in or out, no way to drop supplies, except by a small boat. And there you have 4 Chinese militia vessels who spent over a month sitting less than half a mile away. That's a pretty implicit threat to the Filipino Marines stuck on that reef. I will skip through this. This was an investigation we did of the Uemao Binyu 42212. That's the Chinese fishing boat that rammed and sank a Filipino boat at Reed Bank in June. Suffice to say that while we don't have any smoking guns to prove it's a member of the Maritime Militia, it operates out of a port, the Boha port in Dien Bai district, known to house a militia unit. It has extremely spotty AIS traffic. It has been contracted at least twice to engage in state-sponsored research. And there is no indication that it's ever commercially fished. And so I'll wrap up there, leaving you with this point. If current trends continue, it will be impossible for any civilian actor, whether a fisherman or an oil and gas operator or even a law enforcement vessel from Vietnam to Philippines or Malaysia to operate anywhere in the 9-dash line with any level of acceptable risk. And that is entirely the point. Thank you.
Greg, for the very detailed updates about the situation in the South China Sea through the AMT perspective. I would like to think that maybe because of time constraint, you have not provided us with a fuller picture of what Vietnam, to your perspective, the Philippines, Malaysia, and others, the stakeholders have been doing in the area. So you are more than welcome to provide us with that. But luckily, we have speakers, panelists from the countries that I have just mentioned. So, Marites, you have the floor, and not more than 10 or 12, okay, minutes.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. Yes, my presentation will be from the point of view of the Philippines, and I'm glad that there are 2 judges from the arbitral tribunal who are here, who participated in the Philippines versus China case. So if you have questions on the decision, you can always ask them, Judge Wolfram and Judge Paula. Anyway, good morning. Today I will make 3 main points in my brief presentation in response to the guide questions given for this panel. First is that President Rodrigo Duterte, the President of the Philippines, his pivot towards China has threatened Philippine sovereign rights over what we call West Philippine Sea. And the second point is, how did this happen? Because he has disregarded the 2016 ruling of the International Tribunal, which, as we all know, invalidated China's 9-dash line. And he has not sought the support of the international community to put pressure on China to uphold the ruling, even if partially. He has also not consistently stood up to China, despite its incursions in Philippine waters, as Greg has shown the number of incidents. And the president has also framed false policy choices. He says to the public, either we talk to China or we go to war. There is no middle ground. As a result, the president has weakened the position of the Philippines in regards to negotiating with China. And the last point, but this has also already been discussed by Greg, but Chinese presence in the West Philippine Sea has escalated, and I'll show you a brief timeline later. And the Philippines is missing opportunities to use a number of diplomatic options to partly enforce the ruling. So this is the outline of my presentation. I'll give a background and context. The second is I'll talk briefly about the Philippines versus China case. And the third is the most frequently asked questions. So now, what happens? How does the Philippines move forward? So let me start with friends with benefits. When President Duterte visited China just in late August this year, some in the Department of Foreign Affairs were taken by surprise because he had just met with President Xi Jinping in April, barely a few months ago, during the Belt and Road Forum in Beijing. In the first half of the president's 6-year term, he has visited China 5 times and met with Xi Jinping 8 times, more often than most of his predecessors. So why another trip at this time? The Office of the President announced that he was going to raise the arbitral ruling with Xi, because this has been a point of contention in the Philippines. And he also said he was going to take up economic and business deals with China, because as we know, China has refused to recognize the tribunal's decision. And public pressure in the Philippines is growing for the president to assert Philippine rights over West Philippine Sea. In June 2019, a survey by a leading poll outfit, the Social Weather Station, showed that most Filipinos do not trust China. China scored a -24 rating, considered poor, and this negative rating has been consistent through the years. And the same poll found out that nearly 9 out of 10 Filipinos want Duterte to assert country sovereign rights over West Philippine Sea. So this, Duterte responded to this by bringing up the tribunal in August, the tribunal's decision in August, but as expected, she rejected the ruling. So for many of us in the Philippines, the president used the arbitral ruling as a magic wand. By raising it, he hoped to erase negative perceptions that he is subservient to China. But beyond that, he has closed the door to other diplomatic options to partly enforce the ruling. And I'll enumerate some of these later, but broadly they range from entering into sea boundary agreements with claimant countries like Vietnam and Malaysia, and also to sending Philippine Coast Guard patrols in the area. So 3 years after the pivot to China, I'd like to just review what have been the benefits of this pivot. Remember that Duterte said that when he visited Beijing in 2016, that the Philippines was going to rely on China for economic deliverance. He announced his separation from the United States, and he said that the Philippines will be dependent on China. So now, after 3 years, China has escalated its presence in the West Philippine Sea, yet in terms of foreign direct investment and official development assistance, these have been slow in coming. I think the most dramatic change has been in the foreign direct investments, which has risen dramatically from $28.79 million in 2016 to $198.68 million in 2018. But China has not outpaced the Philippines' traditional sources of FDI, like US, Singapore, and Japan. In the first quarter of this year, China ranked second already in terms of FDI, next to Japan. How about in terms of official development assistance? China has been a poor performer, not even part of the top 10 in 2017, wherein Japan has been a consistent leader, followed by the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, US, South Korea, etc. And as of March this year, our National Economic Development Authority reported that the top ODA sources were basically the same, and China climbed to the 8th place. So in terms of trade, China has become our biggest source of imports, making it our top trading partner, but imports from China overtook Philippine exports, resulting in a wide trade gap. And for tourist arrivals, China overtook Korea in April, but we are not too sure about the data because this may include those who enter as tourists but end up working in online gaming companies, of which China has many in the Philippines. So in sum, after 3 years of Duterte's embrace of China, China has not surpassed our country's traditional sources of investments and ODA. The trade picture is uneven in favor of China, and it's only in tourism where China has started to lead. So the friends with benefits, it looks that China has more benefits than the Philippines. So I'll go briefly now to the timeline of the skirmishes, of which some already were covered by Greg, but a recent one which caused some emotional discussion in the Philippines was in June this year, a Chinese, apparently Maritime Militia, as AMTI has studied, rammed into a Philippine fishing boat in the country's exclusive economic zone, leaving 22 fishermen to the elements, and these fishermen were rescued by our Vietnamese neighbors. And then more skirmishes followed. This was dismissed as simply a maritime incident by the president. I'll just give a timeline, and because we have, I have to rush this, but you can go over this from September 2016 up to 2018 and more. These are all our experiences. Okay. More skirmishes, and this is the Sierra Madre, which Greg mentioned, which stands guard to Ayungin, as we call it. And more incidents have happened, even caught by Philippine TV footage showing one of them showing the Coast Guard taking the catch of the Filipino fishermen. So what did the Philippines win? So as I said earlier, there are 2 eminent judges who are here, but basically the arbitral tribunal said that the China's 9-dash line is illegal, that none of the Spratly Islands, none of the Philippines' entitlements are overlapped by any of China's, and that China has done a lot of harm to the marine environment. And but overall for the Philippines, it has clarified the claims, and that there's a much smaller size now, which is under contention. So how does the Philippines move forward? That's what we want. Okay, since I'm a journalist and I chronicle this story from the Philippines' point of view, there have been a number of suggestions from the experts, including Justice Carpio, who has proposed maybe 9 to 11 ways, because I must remind you that Duterte said publicly that he wanted ideas from the experts on how to move forward. He was crowdsourcing for ideas. So Justice Carpio responded by naming about 9 or 11 options, from entering into sea boundary agreements with our other claimant countries. And the former Foreign Secretary Albert Del Rosario has suggested that the Philippines go to the UN General Assembly, like what Nicaragua did against the US when it went to the World Court, because what happened was the UN General Assembly issued resolutions in support of Nicaragua, and US, which was ordered to pay reparations, eventually did, but they called it aid. So there are many lessons to learn, actually, from countries which have gone to the World Court, and in those cases, there are some which did not participate. So on that note, I'd like to end my talk, and good morning to everyone.
Marites, thank you very much for very another detailed accounts on what the Philippines has been doing since last year. Now, Sumathy, you have the floor, and we really look forward to hearing what you have to say about Malaysia.
Thank you, Professor. Can you hear me? First and foremost, I would like to thank the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam for the invitation and to have me here at this important meeting. So the title given to us was to assess the state of affairs, primarily the threat, risk, and to see whether there's opportunities for the claimants and as well the interested party to work together in the management of the South China Sea. So the state of affair, I would discuss not, of course, China is the primary actor and ASEAN claimants are the main claimants in the South China Sea, but I would like to discuss the state of affairs in the context of all the interested party and the development of geopolitics and geostrategic that have a bearing on the South China Sea dispute. So the overlapping claims is referred as the most complex territorial claims, and it's more problematic now with the added US-China relation. The emergence of strategic attention on the Indian Ocean, China is flexing its influence economically, politically, as well as building facilities or posts in the Indian Ocean, which have also created a great deal of attention on how China is growing outside Asia. And this has some way implicated and also increased the attention on South China Sea. The emergence of the new geostrategic construct of Indo-Pacific with added attention from US, Japan, Australia, and India coming together and trying to form, of course, multilateral cooperation, governance, rule of law, and economic opportunity besides what China is offering to Southeast Asian countries. But I believe that the development of Indo-Pacific will also have some bearing in the South China Sea. So, and most importantly is the increasing Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea. Greg have given everything on the ground, the patrol, the coast guards, the fisheries vessels, and the PLA Navy vessels escorting the coast guard vessels and so on. So I need not dwell into the details. So I see these four primary factors converging interests in the South China Sea, and this has some way, as mentioned in the keynote address this morning and opening sessions, the state of affair in the South China Sea is probably, it's much more worrying than in the last decade or so. So some of the most recent development as far as policy statements and strategic directions are concerned, the US Department of Defense Indo-Pacific Strategy 2019, Chinese own defense white paper in the new era, both are pointing directly, made several reference to, the US actually made reference to China as the primary strategic competitor in Asia, and China in return have directly mentioned the US as provoking and intensifying competition in this part of the region. There are also many other developments. For example, Malaysia is also coming up with a defense white paper to be tabled in the parliament in December. Although there's not, the defense white paper does not make a special reference to South China Sea, but there are some discussion going on both at the defense as well as the foreign affairs that Malaysia has to prepare credible defense forces, signaling for upgrading of militaries and our stations in the South China Sea. Vietnam have also produced a maritime strategic document, and Vietnam aim to strengthen the capacity to ensure national defense, security, and law enforcement at sea. And of course, in Shangri-La dialogue, we have heard statements, official statements from UK, France, EU, pointing out to their concern of Chinese activities and wanting to have more presence, or the UK, for example, France have indicated that they will conduct freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. So here we see on the military development, there are actually 5 claimants, 90 outposts, and of course, shifting military balance. A report published by CIPRI, their annual military assessment, points out that US and China remains as the highest military spenders in this part of the region. So moving on to this Chinese maritime strategy, it is not limited to combat operation that involve weapons and capability. It is complemented by political warfare, including legal, public opinion, and psychological, as well as warfare techniques. So legally, we know there has been in 2013, the arbitration took place and the ruling was out, but China remained on her own historical justification to the 9-line claim. And China have been conducting ongoing media warfare. It is constant, and you can see press statements, foreign affairs, MINDEF statements, and so on. And this will definitely influence the perception and attitudes of those who are following the South China Sea discourse. And psychological warfare, we have in Malaysia, we receive many scholars from China, the senior ones as well as the young upcoming scholars who come to Malaysia and question us why are we illegally present in their area, meaning they are questioning Malaysia's own military vessels and patrol vessels, because in their mind the entire South China Sea belongs to them. Hence, so this is something that is really worrying. The agencies that actually involve on the Chinese side on the management of South China Sea includes the Ministry of Public Security, Ministry of Land and Resource, the Central Military Commissions, the Paramilitary of Armed Forces, the Coast Guard, and military branches. So the whole structure and system are working in coordination to deal with on South China Sea matters on the Chinese side. Now, just to add on to what Greg have presented, the most recent incidents, there are several incidents involving fishing vessels, naval vessels, as well as in April 2019, February, March, and also the most recent one, reports have emerged in September 30. There's Chinese vessels, seems to be like naval warship in contact with commercial ship near this Kabarov Shoal. So this slides actually to show that the incidents are happening, and it is something that ASEAN have been discussing to minimize, avoid incidences. Many ASEAN discussion have taken place, but nothing have actually prevented the incidents from happening on the ground. The recent other than law enforcement, fisheries vessels and so on, there are also Chinese Vietnam incident of the Vanguard 2014 and also 2019, Chinese Philippines incident on the Reed Bank, Titu Island, and so on, and also Marites just mentioned about the Chinese act of sinking Filipino fishing vessels. Of course, Chinese is illegally present in Luconia Breakers since 2013. Greg call it patrolling, but I would call it illegal presence. That's our position. And also, US conducted 21 freedom of navigations in South China Sea since 2015. This is not new. I know the US have been conducting freedom of navigation prior to the arbitration and so on, and there have been incidents in 2001, 2002 between the US Navy and the Chinese, for example, the impeccable incident. But what I'm saying is the US have been firmly conducting many freedom of navigation, and it is bound to continue. And US and China, US and ASEAN have conducted maritime exercises, and both the host and the last point of was in Thailand and Shanghai. Both are not claimants. Maybe ASEAN is trying to be part of US-ASEAN maritime exercises, but Malaysia was only observers. I'm not sure about the other country, but Malaysia's position at that exercise was only as observer. So I should think that the state of affair in the South China Sea will be problematic. There are bound for crises to happen because of the joint petroleum exploration in the EEZ and the continental shelf. And of course, the concern of ADs is there. And also claimants attempting to designate marine parks as means to effectively monitor and regulate activities could also create more law enforcement issues. And also intensification of military drills and operation by China, by US, and also other countries. There are many existing crisis management tool in place. I will not read it out, but you have ASEAN China, you have US China, we have the queues, the call rack, and so on and so forth. But to what effect these tools have been able to reduce incidents, that is the key, and that is what ASEAN and China, and also the members of ADMM Plus are trying to achieve, which has not been very much successful. So in conclusion, I would think that the state of affair, it's still based on competition and contention. Strategic environment seems to revolve around US-China relations, and the FNOPs are a clear aim to challenge Chinese advancement and any excessive claims and military development. And on the other hand, China is increasing its capability, its hardened facilities in the South China Sea, which is also inviting more and more outside parties to be actively involved in the South China Sea discussion. And the strategic competition and contestation have moved from the ASEAN-centric Asia-Pacific into a larger multilateral security region, and the Indo-Pacific is expected to increasingly dominate the strategic environment, and the South China Sea will be on the high tone for a mid to long term. Thank you.
Sumathy, thank you very much for your account on the state of affairs in the South China Sea, and I think that we are really appreciative what you bring the South China Sea into the picture of the big powers, the relations and strategies that include the China-US relations, the importance of the Indian Ocean, and then the development among the Quad, and of course the Chinese assertiveness. And I really am interested in the point you raised about the legal, media, and psychological warfare that China is engaging. So I think that is a very good point here for me to invite Professor Hu from China. And before you take the floor, let me once again thank you for your participation. We understand that in such a forum like this, we really need the voice and the participations of Chinese scholars to make it better understand the Chinese viewpoints in this issue. Thank you very much, and you have the floor.
First, thanks for Vienna Academy of Foreign Affairs to invite me to attend this conference. And I listened to the three speakers. I have some opinions. First, regarding the Vanguard back, China has sovereignty over the Nansa Islands and its adjacent waters, and has sovereignty rights and jurisdiction over the relevant waters. China's claim is in line with international law, including the UNCLOS. In May this year, in disregard of China's firm opposition, Vietnam unilaterally started drilling activities for oil and gas in waters under China's jurisdiction in the South China Sea, which is the cause of the current situation. Since the beginning of July, the relevant Chinese ship has been all along operating in waters under China's jurisdiction. My second point is that with regard to Kapil's proposals, apparently Kapil hoped to escalate the South China Sea situation. I see most of these suggestions are unrealistic and will lead to outright confrontation. Communicate the South China Sea situation is not at all hopeful to the peace and stability of the South China Sea. My third opinion is that about Putin's opinion. I think U.S. has been repeatedly accusing China of engaging in gray zone competition against the U.S. since 2015. But yet, it's the United States itself being a master of gray area. Competition conducting all sorts of maritime gray zone operations against China as well, which include propaganda campaigns, freedom of navigation operations, sending Coast Guard vessels to the South China Sea, and forward military deterrence. My fourth opinion is that in terms of so-called militarization, it is the U.S. who militarized the South China Sea. The United States Department of Defense and military have been continuously increasing all kinds of operations in the South China Sea. Putin has become policy have become increasingly militarized. Last year, the United States military significantly increased the frequency and intensity of its freedom of navigation operations, which is about once every 8 weeks on average. With the 12 nautical miles where the Chinese side stations on islands and reefs of the Nansa Islands, the United States military often conducted high-speed maneuvers, exercise, training, and other provocative activities. The White House and the National Security Council will no doubt support the U.S. military to continue stepping up operations, but after the approval of the annual plan for the South China Sea, little attention has been dedicated, and the United States Indo-Pacific Command headquarters have had more freedom to conduct operations, which in turn and to the risks and hazards. I think the freedom of navigation proposals is not about the passage, but focus on challenging China's claim in the South China Sea. It could hardly be considered out of the scope of militarization. For a long time, the South China Sea has maintained overall stability, freedom of navigation, and oversight have never been an issue. As a big trading nation, China has always worked hard to maintain the stability in the South China Sea. In recent years, the bilateral consultation channels have been smooth for claimants, and important progress has been made in COC negotiations. I believe the so-called tension in South China Sea is merely an agenda deliberately created. I also believe parties directly concerned have different views, so do ASEAN countries and international community. And the last point is that disregarding the efforts of relevant countries unilaterally playing up the tension will only backfire. Those proposals based on the presumption will only backfire too. There are more than 18% of China's oil transportation goes through the South China Sea. So China is more committed to promoting the peace and the stability in South China Sea than any external country. Today, my topic is that the policies, characteristics, paths, and geographical influence in South China Sea for Donald Trump's administration. Slide. No, sorry. Here. Abstract, because of the limited time, I can't read. The first is that use the South China Sea issue to continue to maintain the United States-led geopolitical security pattern actively. There are some details. The second, I say something about the second. The policy in South China Sea is gradually militarized, as I mentioned before. First, the military deployment and operations in South China Sea have been strengthened significantly. Increase of the number of the aircraft carriers in South China Sea. And the military factors and military means for the policy in South China Sea of the United States have increased sharply. The Donald Trump's government's military actions have increased significantly, and its dependence on military means has also enhanced. The third, the United States is increasing the density of U.S. military operations around the South China Sea, decentralize the authority for examination and approval of operations, simplify the examination and approval process from the case handling to annual plan, expand the right of the Ministry of Defense to enter the area in the South China Sea, and maximize the strategic benefits while provoking the conflicts between the neighboring countries and China. My third point is that the joint military exercise is practical with the goal of China. We know that the military exercises in South China Sea with Japan, India, the Philippines, Thailand, and other neighboring countries of China. The United States and the 10 ASEAN countries held a joint maritime military exercise in Thailand this year with the theme of strengthening common understanding and cooperation in the maritime field. The Golden Cobra joint military exercise, the 2019 Golden Cobra joint military exercise project focuses on the command post exercise, the actual combat training exercise, and humanitarian rescue exercise. The United States, Japan, and Australia have also held many different joint military exercises. of time, so I quick. Okay. Yeah. The second is that the main path of the policy for the Trump administration in South China Sea. There are some details about the Trump administration. Yeah. Second, strengthen the security cooperation with allies and neighboring countries. Third, introduce the marine police force actively and strengthen the frontier military presence in the South China Sea. Especially, the United States sent the Coast Guard vessels to South China Sea in this year. The fourth, integrate India into the global strategy of the United States vigorously and enhance India's role in the South China Sea region actively. The third is that the geopolitical influence of the Trump's policy in the South China Sea. We know that the Trump's administration's aim is that to build a new geopolitical security pattern in the South China Sea led by the United States. Now, there are some details. The second is that the situation in the South China Sea is further complicated by the United States. The third is that weaken and hedge China's growing political and diplomatic influence in the South China Sea with military deterrence. The United States regards China's military actions in the South China Sea as a challenge to its Indo-Pacific security system and tries to force China's actions in the South China Sea to retreat with punitive actions. The fourth, to obstruct and disrupt the process of China's peaceful reunification. Yeah, we know that Donald Trump's administration is to strengthen the military deterrence to China at sea, form a strategic joint force with China, for China to compromise and yield on the issue of national interests, and achieve the strategic purpose of destroying and obstructing China's national unity and China's rise. The Trump administration used the South China Sea issue to enhance Taiwan's status, strengthen arms sales to Taiwan, and give more support to Taiwan. The fifth, to abuse and misinterpret the knowledge of international law. Now, there are some details. Okay, my conclusion. China and the United States should maintain the close strategic communication and strategic restraint, and work together to build a framework to restrain competition in order to avoid the continuous escalation of the security situation in the South China Sea and reduce the risks of competition and conflicts. And I always think that we can build the community of shared destiny to create a harmonious sea in the South China Sea. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hu, for your account on the situation in the South China Sea from your perspective. And I think that we also recognize that in the presentation you have highlighted the worsening, in my words, worsening and more complicated situation in the South China Sea through the militarization activities, and you focus on the on what the United States has been doing in that regard. And I think that your presentation also brings, like Sumathy has also provided us with the US-China more competitive relationship as the background for the analysis of the situation in the South China Sea. So I think that we have four presentations that give us detailed account on what has what has been happening in the South China Sea from various perspectives of the countries in the region. And now we have the opportunity to invite Bill Hayton to take the floor as the commentator. So, so Bill, please take the floor and feel free to fill any gaps that the panelists do not have time to speak of. You have the floor, Bill.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the presenters for their papers, which have been printed, and their remarks here. So Greg has given us a satellite's eye view of what's actually been happening on the water, and his focus has really been on China's behavior towards its Southeast Asian maritime neighbors. Marites has also seen developments from a Southeast Asian claimant's perspective and reflected on the state of Philippines politics. Professor Hu, on the other hand, sees everything through the lens of a US-China power competition with very little mention of China's behavior towards its neighbors. There's only one comment in his printed paper in which he describes the Philippine arbitration as a legal farce. Sumathy's paper sits in between. Like Professor Hu, she has prioritized the US-China competition as the primary driver, but also talks about China's actions towards its Southeast Asian neighbors. If I could start with a comment in Professor Hu's paper. He says, the United States uses its strong military presence in the South China Sea to obstruct China's peaceful settlement of the South China Sea disputes and increase the difficulty of China's settlement of the South China Sea issue. So what, therefore, is China's vision for the peaceful settlement of the South China Sea issue? What does China want to achieve? Well, Greg's conclusion is that China wants a veto over all economic activity within the U-shaped line, the 9-dash line. And the confrontations that began in May this year seem to demonstrate that China continues to regard the U-shaped line as some kind of legal boundary. If you look at the traces of the surveys that Greg was referring to, at one point they come within 66 nautical miles of the coast of Vietnam. And my somewhat amateurish overlay of the maps suggests that the Chinese survey treated the U-shaped line dashes as some kind of boundary. They didn't cross them onto the Vietnamese side, but they regarded them more or less as Chinese exclusive economic zone. This, as all the legal advisors in the room will know, is a travesty of the legal position. The International Arbitral Tribunal comprehensively demolished the idea that the U-shaped line could be any kind of claim on maritime resources. Moreover, new research has demonstrated that back in 1946-47, when the line was being drawn in the ministries of the Republic of China, it was never intended to be a maritime claim. The idea of historic rights was actually invented by some Taiwanese legal activists in the early 1990s. So we have yet to hear what China's legal argument actually is. Foreign Minister Wang Yi, speaking to ASEAN ministers in July, called the areas of confrontation disputed, but didn't provide any basis for that claim. Professor Hu's paper makes no mention of legal basis of China's actions either. He talked about areas under Chinese jurisdiction, but can't explain how they come to be so. My own research has revealed the chaotic history of China's claim-making and the fact that in 1936, a Chinese geography professor confused some underwater features in the South China Sea, Vanguard Bank, James Shoal, etc., as islands and then drew a line around them, is unfortunately the origin of the current U-shaped line. China's legal position is to try to find some underpinning for a geographer's mistake back in the 1930s. So we are left with a case of might versus right. In August this year, a Chinese guided missile destroyer sailed through the English Channel, through the territorial seas of several European countries. It was not hindered, it was not harassed, its passage was in no way stopped. So how can China object to other countries' warships sailing through claimed territorial waters in the South China Sea? It seems a clear case of hypocrisy. Professor Hu says that despite China's opposition, the US is increasing the frequency of ships moving through these strategic waterways. Does Professor Hu actually believe that China has the right to control freedom of navigation through the entire South China Sea? You talk of the Trump administration trying to impose the soft constraints on China. Well, frankly, who else is going to make China abide by the international norms of behavior? Don't you accept that it is China's behavior in the South China Sea that has provoked all of these responses? So what really is all this about? China currently occupies 7 features in the Spratlys. Would occupying an 8th actually make China more secure? I would argue that an extra island or 2 here would do nothing for China's security. So why then is China apparently dedicated to squeezing out the presence of all the other claimants in the South China Sea? Is this a story of blinkered nationalism, that really every single rock and reef has to have a Chinese flag on it before Xi Jinping can feel secure in Beijing? Or is this, and I think Japanese commentators have focused on this, really about the battle over submarines and the idea that China wishes to turn the South China Sea into a bastion in which it hides its ballistic missile submarines, in which case it would seem that its ambition is indeed to clear out every other claimant from the features of the South China Sea and to clear out the US Navy and any other outside navies and impose hegemony, sea control within the South China Sea as a base for its ballistic missile submarine fleet, in which case we are in for a very bumpy ride. In the process of doing so, what it seems to be doing is undermining the regime of international law, a law in particular referring to UNCLOS, which China, the People's Republic of China, was fully involved in drafting and ratified more than 20 years ago and now seems to be trying to undermine. It puts Vietnam in a very difficult position, particularly if we compare its response this year with the response in 2014. Back then, Vietnam had vocal support from ASEAN. There was an ASEAN statement which was clearly aimed at supporting Vietnam's position back in 2014. And Vietnam was also able to play public diplomacy very astutely by taking journalists, for example, out to the scenes of confrontation, and we saw pictures of Chinese vessels ramming Vietnamese vessels. And it's possibly interesting to think about why Vietnam has not done that this time. Obviously, ASEAN is in a weaker place, particularly with the governments in the Philippines and Cambodia. But it's also, I think, worth thinking, in some ways, Vietnam's domestic politics have constrained its ability to use public diplomacy. You may remember back in 2014 that there were quite large-scale protests on the streets in Vietnam as a result of China's activities. And I suspect that possibly the government at the moment is not willing to run the risk of stirring up public emotion on this and has therefore played a less strong public diplomacy hand, which I think has constrained its international response to China's actions too. So I think Vietnam has to consider really how much it wants access to the hydrocarbons and the fish of the South China Sea. And part of that will be surely a calculation as to how much support for the government budget those hydrocarbon activities, those fisheries activities place, and what the impact for Vietnam would be of losing the gas and oil reserves, and the impact on domestic electricity generation, and therefore the wider economic impact if Vietnam cannot develop, for example, the Blue Whale gas-to-power plants being proposed by Exxon. And with ASEAN being an unreliable player at the moment, we have to see how well Vietnam will chair ASEAN over the coming 12 months, whether it can forge some kind of consensus and united position, but one has to say that the omens don't look great. Can it cultivate support from other law-focused states around the world, in Europe or in North America, other places? Well, it can, but don't expect those states to do anything more assertive than Vietnam does itself. So Vietnam really has to take the lead on this. And so this brings us, I think, to the elephant in the room today, which is whether Vietnam is going to take its own arbitration case in the same way that the Philippines did. It's clear that there would be a political cost to this, that China would be deeply, deeply unhappy with Vietnam for doing so, but China does seem to be closing down all the other options. So what else can Vietnam do? Thank you.
Bill, thank you very much for a very good recap what has been said by the panelist fellows here. I was reminded that we have just 7 minutes before the break. So what can I do? I think that I would base the Q&A section on Bill's engagement here. And in fact, Bill has put some questions for the panelists, especially for Professor Hu. So I think that I would start by inviting all the panelists to respond to the points that have been raised by Bill. And I think that we would reserve our questions from the floor for the next sections. And for the questions that Bill raised for the about the Vietnam's choices, I would like to encourage all the international participants to interact with our Vietnamese participants here, either in the panels or outside the panels, in order to get some hints from what Vietnam should do in this context. So in the reverse order, I would like to invite Professor Hu to have 3 minutes to respond to the points raised by Bill.
Yeah, I don't agree with the discussant's opinions. We know that China is a loving peace country. We are scholars. We are not politicians. We must abide by the facts. And you know that from the ancient history, the South China Sea belongs to China. And the Chinese is the first to work, to active in South China Sea. Do you know? Maybe you know not. You don't know this history. I'm born the history. I know the details in our country's history. I have some opinions. First is that China have the rights to do everything in China's sovereignty, including economical activities, military activities. Second, just now I mentioned from the ancient, it's the Chinese people fish work in the South China Sea. And we have some books, the earliest books published of the world to identify the South China Sea. Third, I think the cooperation is only one choice for China and relative claimants, such as Philippines. Do you know, we two countries to sign the memorandum in Beijing last week. We are co-develop the oil and gas in the South China Sea. And the last point is that China is always abiding by the UN UNCLOS. And up till now, the United States hadn't joined the UNCLOS. The last point is that, China has never sent our own warships to other countries. Why do the United States and other countries, outside the countries of the South China Sea, to send their warships to the South China Sea? And we know that in this week, the ASEAN summit held in Thailand, we signed many agreements, and all participants claim to their cooperation in South China Sea. Why do you don't agree with the memorandum of the ASEAN summit?
Okay, Sumathy.
To respond some of the points made by Bill, China continue to guard the 9-dash line. Yeah, I think that is ultimately what China wants to. But Luconia Shoal is, if we go by the 9-dash line, I think Luconia is in the southernmost tip of the 9-dash line. But as far as the other claimants are concerned, it's not valid. The 9-dash line is not valid in the international, within UNCLOS or also in the international legal system. Of course, freedom of navigation, China is challenging the US freedom of navigation, but in my own view, freedom of navigation is provided under UNCLOS as well as the international Navy's operation. So I think no country should attempt to challenge or to stop the freedom of navigation. And you raised one point on domestic concern as to how Vietnam may respond to the Chinese activities. Yes, we in Malaysia also have some form of domestic concern which we have to take into consideration. Economically, we need China for investment, for infrastructure development. But now the government is also looking at balancing the infrastructure and investment with other countries, including Japan. We are working, we supported the Indo-Pacific outlook, the ASEAN's Indo-Pacific outlook. And I think Indo-Pacific has many opportunities rather than the military tone, military aspect. There are governance, there are investment for infrastructure and so on. This is where that ASEAN countries could leverage on. Thank you.
Marites.
Hello? Can everybody hear me? Yes, I just wanted to address one point raised by Professor Hu about the Philippines and China signing a memorandum of understanding. Yes, in Beijing. From the Philippine point of view, I've gathered that there seems to be an impasse because the Philippines wants China to sign this agreement under a service contract. In Philippine law, it's a commercial arrangement, and CNOOC has to enter into a service contract with the holder of the service contract, which is Forum Energy. And the concern is, will China accept this because they implicitly will recognize Philippine sovereignty over Reed Bank. And this is a question which we have not yet seen the answer. And according to the Philippines Department of Energy, it is the only way to move forward on this joint oil and gas exploration in the Reed Bank. So we're all watching this closely if China will indeed agree to a service contract in Reed Bank.
I think it's telling that Bill raised 2 points, one being that most of the panel seemed to discuss Chinese actions toward the other claimants, and Professor Hu only discussed China's views of the US. And then in his response, Professor Hu doubled down on the idea that the only thing that matters is Sino-US relations. It suggests that Southeast Asian parties here lack agency, that what they want, that their complaints, that China's harassment of them is irrelevant, that the only thing that matters are US FONOPs in the South China Sea. I fail to understand what the frequency of US FONOPs has to do with Chinese harassment of Vietnamese oil and gas work at Vanguard Bank, or what US FONOPs have to do with the harassment of Philippine resupply to the Sierra Madre. The claim that freedom of the seas is not being impeded does not match the facts. And I don't deal in opinion, I deal in facts. I just showed you AIS tracks of ships being actively impeded in their economic operations and their EEZs. We just had a commercial tanker near Scarborough Shoal impeded over the weekend. This is the reality in the South China Sea. It is not going to change by banging the table or raising one's voice. The fact is that the cooperation being offered by Beijing is the cooperation offered by a mob boss. I'm going to make it impossible for you to extract any hydrocarbon from the South China Sea. I will make it impossible for you to safely fish in the South China Sea. And then you will accept the idea that you can work with Chinese companies, or you can leave the gas there. Those are your two options. That is not cooperation, that is coercion. And the goal very clearly is that in a couple of years, there will be no options left for Southeast Asians other than to accept the reality of the 9-dash line, of historic rights within the 9-dash line, or to simply go without their resources.
Bill, you have 2 minutes. You don't want, you want?
I think I said everything, so
Okay.
coffee.
Okay. As a moderator, I think that I have to thank all the panelists for making your points loud and clear. And I think that it is a very good warming up exercise for us to go into the next panels or the discussion. And I think that promises the even more than warming. I would like the heated discussion in the next sessions. But I have to say that at least from the very first panel, we have to agree on the very point that the situation in the South China Sea since last year has become more complicated, more difficult. And the words of militarization has been repeated many times, and even we do not have the agreement among even the panelists here. But I think that, like I said, it would be the topic for discussions in the next panels. And with that, I would like to invite you to give a big approach to the panelists and the commentator for the first section, please. We have any housekeeping announcements?
The coffee break will be served outside the conference room. We will be back in 15 minutes. Now it's 11. We'll be back at 11:15. Thank you.